47 aircraft confirmed destroyed or damaged beyond near-term repair across 6 Russian airbases in a single coordinated operation conducted over approximately 14 hours. Strategic bombers, fighter bombers, airborne early warning platforms, and a smaller but operationally significant number of specialized electronic warfare aircraft. The losses include platforms that the Russian aerospace industry cannot replace inside this campaign season, and in 2 specific categories cannot replace inside this decade. Now, I want to be very direct with you about why those numbers matter and why they do not matter, because the conversation around this operation is going to be shaped by people who will either reduce it to an aircraft body count or inflate it into a strategic turning point, and neither of those readings will help you understand what actually happened across those 14 hours or what it means for the broader trajectory of the war. Aircraft losses in absolute terms are a meaningful indicator, but the indicator that matters more is the relationship between what was destroyed and what the Russian aerospace force can continue to do operationally. The 47 airframes are the visible damage. The capability gap those airframes leave behind is the actual damage. And the capability gap is what anyone studying this professionally has to focus on. To understand how the operation was constructed, you have to start with what Russian airbase posture had been across the previous 18 months, because the targeting concept Ukraine executed was designed to exploit specific characteristics of that posture, and the characteristics were not accidental features. They were the result of deliberate Russian decisions made in response to earlier Ukrainian strike operations, and the decisions had created vulnerabilities that the original posture had not contained. Russian strategic and tactical aviation in the early phase of the war had operated from forward bases that were close enough to the front to allow short-cycle sortie generation against Ukrainian targets. The proximity was operationally efficient. It was also vulnerable, and the vulnerability was demonstrated repeatedly across the first 2 years of the war as Ukrainian strike capabilities extended their range and improved their targeting accuracy. The Russian response was rational. Forward-deployed aviation assets were progressively withdrawn to bases at greater operational depth, and the most valuable platforms were concentrated at facilities that the Russian command assessed as being beyond the practical reach of Ukrainian strike systems. The assessment was correct in 2023. It was largely correct in 2024. It was no longer correct by the operation we are discussing, and the gap between the assessment and the reality was the gap that Ukrainian planners had identified and built their concept around. The withdrawal to depth had produced a specific operational geometry that anyone studying Russian basing decisions can read from open-source imagery. The most valuable platforms were concentrated at a relatively small number of bases. The concentration reflected the logistics requirements of those platforms, which need specialized maintenance infrastructure that cannot be replicated at every airfield, and it reflected the security assumption that the depth of the bases provided protection against strike. The concentration was operationally rational under the original threat assessment. The concentration became operationally catastrophic when the threat assessment stopped being valid, because once the assumption of depth-based protection failed, the concentration meant that a single strike package directed against a small number of locations could produce damage to the aircraft inventory that would have been impossible to produce against a more dispersed posture. Ukraine had been working toward the strike capability required to reach those bases for considerably longer than the operation itself suggests. The deep strike systems that conducted the operation were not single-platform systems. They were a combined package that integrated long-range one-way attack drones, ground-launched cruise missiles in Ukrainian inventory, air-launched systems delivered by Ukrainian platforms operating at the edge of their effective range, and at least one category of system whose specific characteristics are not yet fully clarified in open-source reporting, but that appears to have provided the terminal penetration capability against the most heavily defended of the 6 target bases. The package was not assembled in the weeks before the operation. It was the product of years of development, training, and the patient acquisition of the targeting intelligence that made the strikes possible. The targeting intelligence is the part of this that anyone studying the operation professionally has to focus on, because the operation could not have succeeded without it, and the intelligence collection that produced it represents an analytical achievement that is separate from and arguably more significant than the kinetic execution. Each of the 6 bases had to be mapped with sufficient precision to identify the specific dispersal locations of the most valuable aircraft, the location and operational status of the air defense systems protecting each base, the routing of the fuel and ammunition supply that the aircraft depended on, and the operational rhythms that determined when the most valuable platforms would be present at the base rather than airborne or relocated to alternate facilities. The mapping was sustained, multi-source, and conducted over a period that suggests Ukrainian intelligence services had identified the operational opportunity months before the strike package was ready to exploit it. The wave structure of the operation reflected the targeting intelligence directly. The first wave, arriving across the 6 target bases within approximately a 40-minute window, was directed against the air defense systems protecting each base and against the radar and command facilities that coordinated those systems. The wave was not designed to destroy aircraft. It was designed to suppress the defensive systems that would otherwise engage the strike packages aimed at the aircraft, and the suppression was sequenced to maximize the temporary degradation of the defensive picture before the consequential portion of the operation arrived. The lower-value drone systems and a portion of the cruise missile inventory were committed in this wave on the calculation that the air defense ammunition expended against them would be ammunition that was not available to engage the systems that arrived behind them. The second wave, arriving approximately 45 minutes after the first, was directed against the dispersal areas where the highest value aircraft were located. The targeting was specific. Open source reporting and the pattern of subsequent damage assessments suggest that the strike systems in this wave were directed against individually identified aircraft rather than against the dispersal areas generically. This is the part of the operation that demonstrates the depth of the targeting intelligence most clearly. Striking a dispersal area produces probabilistic damage to whatever aircraft happen to be located there. Striking the specific positions of specific aircraft produces deterministic damage to those aircraft. The difference is the difference between a strike operation that hopes to achieve effects and a strike operation that has been engineered to produce a specific outcome against specific targets. The third wave, arriving in the hours after the first 2, was directed against the maintenance infrastructure, the fuel storage, and the runway surfaces at each of the 6 bases. The third wave was the wave that converted the immediate damage from the second wave into the longer-term capability gap. The aircraft destroyed in the second wave were the headline losses. The maintenance infrastructure destroyed in the third wave meant that the aircraft that had survived the second wave could not be returned to operational status on the timeline they would otherwise have required, because the facilities required to service them had been damaged at the same time as the airframes themselves. The runways were not destroyed in the absolute sense, but they were damaged in patterns that required sustained engineering work to restore, which meant that even aircraft that survived undamaged and that retained functioning maintenance support could not generate sorties from their primary bases until the runway restoration was completed. Now, I want to take you inside one Russian airbase during the third hour of the operation, because the operational picture only makes sense when you can see what was happening at the level of the people trying to manage it. A duty officer at the base operations center of one of the targeted facilities. A lieutenant colonel experienced in the operations center because he was the senior officer on duty when the first wave arrived. He has been at his station for 3 hours. He has been receiving reports from the various elements on the base for that entire period, and the reports describe a situation that is developing faster than the procedures available to him are designed to manage. The air defense battery covering the base was engaged in the first wave. He has reports from the battery commander that confirm the battery is no longer combat effective, having expended the majority of its interceptor inventory against the first wave and having taken physical damage from cruise missiles directed against its radar and command vehicle in the second portion of that wave. The base air defense, which had been the load-bearing assumption underneath every other security measure at the facility, no longer exists in any meaningful sense. He has reports from the dispersal areas. 3 of the 4 primary dispersal locations on the base have taken direct hits during the second wave. The damage assessment is preliminary, but the preliminary assessment is bad. Aircraft that he can name, specific airframes that the base has been maintaining and operating for years, are either destroyed or damaged beyond the capacity of the base maintenance facility to repair. The aircraft are not abstractions. They are specific machines that the base has invested years of maintenance and crew training in, and they are gone. He has reports from the maintenance facility. The facility was struck in the early part of the third wave. The damage to the facility itself is significant, but the damage that matters more is the damage to the specialized equipment inside the facility, the test stands, and the diagnostic systems, and the parts inventory that the base depends on to keep its aircraft operational. That equipment is not replaceable from internal Russian aerospace industry capacity inside any near-term time frame because the equipment was originally sourced from supply chains that have been substantially disrupted by the sanctions regime and that have been operating on substitute components and reduced inventory for the past 2 years. He has in front of him the operational status board that the base uses to track aircraft and infrastructure status. The board is being updated in real time as reports come in. He watches the board move from a status picture that represented a fully operational base at the beginning of his shift to a status picture that represents a base that has, in the space of 3 hours, lost the majority of its operational capability and that will not regenerate that capability on any time frame he can predict. He has communications with the higher headquarters. The communications are functioning. He has been reporting up at intervals throughout the operation. The higher headquarters is receiving similar reports from the other 5 targeted bases simultaneously. The picture at the higher headquarters is the picture of an aerospace force that has, in the space of a single coordinated operation, lost a substantial fraction of its irreplaceable platform inventory and a meaningful fraction of the infrastructure required to support whatever inventory remains. The duty officer makes the calls his procedures require him to make. He requests guidance. He receives guidance. The guidance does not change what has happened. The guidance is about how to manage the consequences of what has happened, and the consequences are going to be managed across a timeline that extends well beyond his shift. He is sitting in a functioning operations center in a base that physically still exists on an air force that on paper still has substantial combat capability. What he is watching is the visible surface of a structural transition in the Russian aerospace force's ability to continue operating at the tempo it has been operating at, and the transition is being executed in real time across his status board and across the equivalent status boards at 5 other bases simultaneously. That is the moment. Not the moment of the strikes themselves, which were over in minutes. The moment of the duty officer watching the status board and understanding that the operational concept the base had been built around no longer applies. The base will continue to exist. The base will continue to be reported on paper as an operational facility. What the base will not be able to do is execute the missions it has been executing on the timeline it has been executing them with the platforms it has been operating. The structural condition of the facility has changed in 3 hours in ways that the formal reporting categories the Russian aerospace force uses to describe itself will struggle to capture honestly. Now let me pull back from the operations center and explain what this engagement reveals about the structural condition of the Russian aerospace force at this point in the war, because this is the part of the analysis that travels beyond the specific 14 hours and tells us something important about where the broader air campaign is heading. The Russian aerospace industry before the war was capable of producing a small number of high-end combat aircraft per year. The production was meaningful in the sense that it kept the inventory at sustainable levels under peacetime consumption rates. The production was not meaningful in the sense that it could replace combat losses at any tempo a serious war would generate, and the war has demonstrated this repeatedly. The 47 aircraft lost in this operation are losses that the production base cannot replace inside this campaign season, and in the most valuable categories cannot replace inside any timeline that is operationally relevant to the war. The categories that matter most here are the specialized platforms. The airborne early warning aircraft are the most analytically significant losses because the inventory of those platforms was small to begin with, and because the production line for replacements has not been operational at any meaningful rate since the war started. Each airborne early warning platform that the Russian aerospace force loses represents a measurable degradation of the force's ability to maintain situational awareness across the operational areas it has been monitoring. The degradation is not theoretical. It produces specific operational effects, and the effects compound across every other Russian aerospace operation that depends on the situational picture those platforms provide. The electronic warfare aircraft are the second category that matters most. The Russian aerospace force had been relying on those platforms to provide the electronic warfare support that has been one of the most effective elements of Russian air operations throughout the war, and the inventory was already smaller than the operational demand. Losing a meaningful fraction of that inventory in a single operation produces a capability gap that the remaining platforms cannot cover, and the production base cannot generate replacement platforms inside any time frame that is relevant to the current campaign. The strategic bombers are the third category, and the analytical significance of those losses extends beyond the operational picture. Strategic bombers carry political weight in Russian military culture that exceeds their immediate tactical utility, and the loss of multiple platforms in a single operation against bases that were considered safe is going to produce political consequences inside the Russian military leadership that will compound the operational consequences. The political consequences will not be visible immediately. They will be visible in the personnel decisions, the basing decisions, and the operational restrictions that the Russian aerospace force imposes on itself in response to the demonstrated vulnerability of platforms that the leadership had considered untouchable. The fighter bombers are the largest category by aircraft count, and they are the category where the production base is least incapable of generating replacements. But even there, the replacement rate is below the loss rate. The fighter bomber inventory has been the workhorse of Russian air operations in this war, and the inventory has been declining slowly throughout the war as combat losses have outpaced replacements. The operation accelerated that decline in a single event, and the acceleration is going to be visible in the tempo of Russian air operations across multiple sectors of the front in the weeks and months following the strike. What this operation reveals about the structural relationship between strike capability and Air Force posture at the peer competitor level is the conversation that anyone in my profession has been having privately for years, and that I think the events of this operation have made it impossible to continue having privately. The model under which strategic and tactical aviation is concentrated at fixed bases for logistics and security reasons is a model that has been the standard across most modern air forces for the past several generations. The model assumes that the bases will be protected either by depth, by air defense, or by the political constraints that prevent adversaries from striking them. The Russian aerospace force was operating under that model, with the protection assumption being primarily depth-based and secondarily air defense-based. The model has just been demonstrated to fail under specific conditions that any peer-level adversary can replicate, and the failure has been demonstrated against an aerospace force that had been treating the protection assumption as load-bearing for the entire force posture. The conditions are not exotic. They require a strike capability with sufficient range to reach the bases, the targeting intelligence to identify the specific aircraft positions, the wave structure to suppress the defensive systems before the consequential strikes arrive, and the planning discipline to execute the operation across multiple targets simultaneously. Ukraine had all four, and Ukraine was not, by the standards of peer-level adversaries, an obvious candidate to be the first state to demonstrate the capability operationally against an aerospace force with the institutional weight of the Russian aerospace force. The fact that Ukraine got there first does not mean that other actors have not been studying the same problem. It means that other actors now have an operational case study to study, conducted against an aerospace force whose posture had been treated as a reasonable baseline by most peer-level air forces. The case study is going to be read carefully in every Air Force headquarters that has ever planned an operation against a peer adversary, and the conclusions that get drawn from it are going to reshape the relationship between strike capability and Air Force basing in ways that anyone in my profession has been trying to anticipate for years, and that have just stopped being theoretical. The 47 aircraft did not represent a defeat for the Russian aerospace force in the absolute sense. The force still exists. The remaining inventory still represents meaningful combat capability. What the operation represented was a demonstration that the basing assumptions the force had been operating under for the past 2 years are no longer valid, and the operational concept built on top of those assumptions has to be reconsidered. That reconsideration is not going to happen quickly because the alternatives to fixed base operation, dispersed operation from austere facilities, increased reliance on civilian airfields, accept higher operational risk at existing bases, all carry costs that the Russian aerospace force has historically been reluctant to accept. The reconsideration is going to happen because the alternative is to continue absorbing losses at a tempo the force cannot sustain. The lesson that travels beyond this specific operation is one that anyone studying modern air operations professionally has been circling around for the better part of a decade. The era in which strategic and tactical aviation could be protected at fixed bases against any plausible adversary strike capability is closing, and it is closing for reasons that are mathematical rather than technological. The strike capabilities are extending their range. The targeting intelligence is becoming more accessible to actors who could not previously have generated it. The defensive systems are operating under saturation pressures that they were not engineered to absorb. An adversary willing to invest the time and resources required to assemble the strike capability, the targeting intelligence, and the planning discipline can produce against a fixed base aerospace posture exactly the kind of consequential damage that the Ukrainian operation produced. The aerospace forces that adjust to this reality are going to be the ones that internalize what happened across those 14 hours and reshape their basing concepts accordingly. The forces that do not are going to continue operating from fixed bases, and the bases are going to continue being struck, and the strikes are going to continue producing exactly the kind of capability gaps that the Russian aerospace force is now going to have to absorb. The basing concept was the load-bearing assumption underneath the force posture. The assumption has been tested. It broke. And the force underneath it is now the case study that every other aerospace force in the world is going to study, whether or not they want to learn what it teaches.